The real estate listing called it 43 acres of wooded recreational land. That was technically true. There were woods somewhere on the property. The problem was that nobody could see them. From the road, the land looked like a wall made out of thorns. Multiflora rose grew in tangled mounds taller than a pickup truck. Bush honeysuckle filled every gap between the trees. Wild grapevine hung from the canopy in ropes thick enough to pull with both hands. Young maples, locust saplings, blackberry canes, and poison ivy had grown together so tightly that the property seemed less like land and more like something the land had built to keep people out. There was no driveway, no visible fence, no open ground, and no way to walk more than 30 feet from the road without getting caught on something. The listing photographs had been taken in January, when the leaves were gone and the brush looked almost manageable. By June, the same hillside turned into a green barricade. The property sat in Monroe County, West Virginia, on the lower side of a long ridge where farms had once been cut into narrow fields by men using horses, axes, and more patience than machinery. The last owner had been a woman named Ruth Hensley. Ruth had been born on the property in 1931 and lived there until she died at 87. For most of her life, she kept 2 fields open with an old Ford tractor and a 5-foot rotary mower. She maintained the lane, cut the brush around the house, and kept the lower hillside from closing in. But during her last 10 years, the tractor mostly stayed in the shed. Her knees went bad, then her eyesight, then the farmhouse roof began leaking. When Ruth died, the property passed to 3 relatives living in different states. None of them wanted the house, none of them wanted the taxes, and none of them wanted to spend money clearing land they had never worked. They hired a local agent, put up a sign, and waited. The first asking price was $39,000. 6 months later, it dropped to $31,000, then $26,000. By the time Caleb Reed found the listing, the price was $22,000, just over $500 an acre, cheap enough to make a person curious. Overgrown enough to explain why nobody had bought it. Caleb was 39 years old and raised meat goats on 28 acres he did not own. He had 67 does, 3 bucks, 2 livestock guardian dogs, and a lease that had gone up twice in 4 years. His goats were mostly Boer-Kiko crosses. They were tough, good mothers, and willing to eat things cattle walked past. They produced well when the weather cooperated and barely broke even when it did not. The operation was small, but it was his. Caleb had built it over 9 years while working 4 days a week repairing diesel equipment at a trucking company outside Union. Every spring, he told himself the same thing. 1 more year on rented ground. 1 more kidding season. 1 more year of saving. Then he would buy land. But land kept getting more expensive faster than he could save for it. A usable 40-acre farm in that part of the county could sell for $140,000 or more. Cleared pasture with water and fencing cost even more. Even rough grazing ground was usually priced beyond what Caleb could borrow without putting the goat operation under so much debt that 1 bad winter would finish it. The Hensley property was different. It had no usable pasture. That was why he could afford it. Caleb drove out on a Sunday afternoon in July and parked beside the faded real estate sign. His wife, Laura, stayed in the truck with the air conditioner running while he tried to enter the property through what the agent described as an old farm lane. The lane existed. At least it had existed once. Caleb found 2 parallel depressions in the ground and followed them uphill for about 40 yards before the brush closed around him. Thorns caught his shirt. Wild grape wrapped around his boots. A locust branch scraped the side of his face. He spent 20 minutes fighting his way forward and nearly that long getting back out. Laura lowered the passenger window when he reached the truck. You look like you lost a fight with a fishing net. Caleb pulled a thorn from his sleeve. I think there's good ground under there. You saw good ground? No. You saw pasture? No. You saw water? No. Laura looked through the windshield at the wall of brush. So what exactly did you see? Caleb wiped blood from the scratch on his cheek. 43 acres I can afford. The neighboring farm belonged to Everett Sloan. Everett was 71 and had lived across the road for 46 years. He ran 18 beef cows and spent his mornings doing the slow, never-ending work of keeping a small farm from returning to forest. He watched Caleb walk the property line the following week. Then he drove over on an old utility vehicle and shut off the engine beside Caleb's truck. You thinking about buying that place? Maybe. Everett looked toward the hillside. You own a bulldozer? No. Track loader? No. Forestry mulcher? No. Everett nodded slowly. Then you're not thinking about buying that place. You're thinking about buying a problem. He told Caleb that the lower field had started disappearing 20 years earlier. First came the multiflora rose, then honeysuckle, then locust. Ruth had kept a narrow path open as long as she could, but after she stopped mowing, the brush moved fast. Everett had seen contractors inspect the property. One estimated $18,000 just to open the lane and clear the first 10 acres. Another said the steepest sections could not be safely mowed until the larger brush was removed by hand or with a tracked machine. You'll spend more clearing it than you spend buying it, Everett said. And after you clear it, the rose comes back. Caleb looked at the hillside. That brush has leaves. Everett glanced at him. Most plants do. My goats eat leaves. Everett laughed once. Not because the idea was funny, because he thought Caleb was serious. You can't turn goats loose in that. You'll never find them again. I'm not turning them loose. What are you doing? Building small paddocks. In that mess? Caleb nodded. Everett stared at him for a few seconds. You're buying 43 acres of thorns so your goats can eat their way through it? I'm not buying pasture, Caleb said. I'm buying feed that hasn't been cut yet. Everett shook his head. Feed doesn't usually fight back. Caleb closed on the property in September for $22,000. He used savings for the down payment and financed the rest through a small agricultural land loan. His payment was $138 a month. The first thing he bought after closing was not a tractor. It was 1,320 feet of portable electric netting, a solar fence charger, and 6 rolls of high-tensile wire. He started along the road where the brush was thick but the ground was relatively level. He used a brush cutter to open a narrow perimeter trail, set corner posts, and built a 2-acre paddock inside the larger property. It took him 9 days. Then he brought 24 goats. The goats stood at the gate and stared into the brush. They were used to pasture, weeds, sumac, blackberry leaves, and the occasional cedar sapling. They were not used to being placed in front of a wall. The lead doe was a 6-year-old Kiko cross named June. June walked forward first. She stretched her neck toward a honeysuckle branch, sniffed it, pulled off 3 leaves, and chewed. Then she took another bite. Within a minute, 5 goats were beside her. Within 5 minutes, the entire group had moved into the brush. Goats do not graze the way cattle do. Cattle lower their heads and pull grass close to the ground. Goats look up. They stand on their hind legs. They climb fallen trunks. They strip leaves from stems, eat tender shoots, and reach into places a mower cannot go. Multiflora rose has thorns, but it also has leaves. Bush honeysuckle is invasive, but its new growth is palatable. Wild grapevine, blackberry, greenbrier, and young locust all contain food at goat height. To Caleb, the property looked overgrown. To the goats, it looked fully stocked. By the end of the first day, the edge of the paddock had changed, not cleared, not open, but thinner. The goats had stripped the leaves from the honeysuckle and eaten every branch they could reach. Multiflora rose canes that had looked like solid green masses were now exposed as gray, tangled stems. After 5 days, Caleb could see between the plants. After 10 days, sunlight was reaching places that had been shaded all summer. He moved the goats into a second paddock and let the first one rest. Then he moved them again. He did not expect the goats to kill everything in one pass. That was not the point. The point was to remove the leaves. A plant can survive cutting. It can survive browsing. But every time it regrows, it must draw energy from its roots. Repeated browsing forces the plant to spend those reserves again and again without enough time to replace them. Caleb was not trying to clear the land in a week. He was trying to make the brush lose slowly. 3 weeks into the project, he found the first stone wall. It ran across the slope beneath the brush, shoulder-high in places and nearly invisible, until the goats removed the leaves around it. The stones were flat, fitted by hand, and covered with moss. Caleb followed the wall for 80 feet before it disappeared into the next paddock. Then he found another one uphill, then a third. The walls were not property boundaries. They ran parallel to each other across the slope, creating long, narrow shelves in the hillside. Terraces. Someone had moved hundreds of tons of stone to shape the land into steps. The goats opened another section. Caleb found a drainage channel lined with rock. Then an old metal gate hanging from a cedar post. Then a rusted horseshoe. Then trees. At first, they looked like every other tree on the property. Old trunks. Broken limbs. Thick vines climbing through the crowns. But these trees were spaced differently. They stood in rows. Not perfect rows anymore. Some had died. Some had fallen. Some were hidden behind younger maples. But the pattern remained. 20 feet between trees. Roughly the same distance between rows. Each tree sat near the outer edge of a stone terrace, where water would drain but roots could still reach deep soil. Caleb counted 11 in the first cleared section. Then 19. Then 27. The trees had short trunks and wide branch angles. Several showed large scars where limbs had been cut decades earlier. On 2 of them, Caleb found a swollen ring low on the trunk. A graft union. He knew enough to recognize what that meant. These trees had not grown from random seeds. Someone had chosen them. Someone had planted rootstock, attached selected wood, trained the branches, and built the hillside around them. Caleb called Laura. "There are trees under here. There are trees everywhere." "No, these are planted." "How do you know?" "They're in rows." There was a pause. "What kind of trees?" "I don't know." Laura came out after work. They walked the terraces together while the goats browsed around them. The property felt different now. What had looked like random wilderness from the road had structure underneath it. Walls, drainage, rows, spacing, evidence of decisions made by people who were no longer there. Laura stopped beside one of the trees and pointed upward. "What's that?" Near the end of a thin branch, half covered by grapevine, hung a green fruit no larger than a golf ball. Caleb pulled the vine down carefully. The fruit was hard, uneven, and spotted. He cut it open with his pocket knife. Inside were small brown seeds and pale flesh that smelled sharp and slightly sweet. "Apple," Laura said. Caleb looked uphill. Once he knew what he was seeing, the hillside changed again. These were not just trees. This was an orchard. The next morning, Caleb took 3 branches, 4 leaves, and the small apple to the county extension office. The agent on duty was Nina Coleman. Nina was 48 and had worked with small farms in southern West Virginia for nearly 2 decades. She had helped identify livestock diseases, soil deficiencies, fruit pests, pasture weeds, and more dead plants than she cared to remember. Caleb set the branches on her desk. "I found these on some land I bought." Nina examined the leaves. Then the buds. Then the cut fruit. "How many trees?" 27 that I can see." "How much of the property have you opened?" "Maybe 8 acres." She looked at the branch again. "Were they planted in rows?" "Yes." "Any graft unions?" "Most of them." Nina leaned back in her chair. "These are apples, old ones." "That part I figured out." "No, I mean old. The branch structure, the bark, the graft height. These trees could be 70 or 80 years old. Some may be older." Caleb showed her photographs of the terraces. Nina zoomed in on one of the stone walls. This was a commercial planting. Commercial? Not necessarily big, but whoever built those terraces was growing enough fruit to justify moving a lot of stone. She turned the apple in her hand. "This isn't a modern dessert apple. It's too small, too tannic, too acidic. It may be a cider variety." Caleb looked at the fruit. "It tastes terrible." "That can be a good sign." "For an apple?" "For cider." Nina explained that many traditional cider apples were never meant to be eaten from the tree. Some were bitter. Some were dry enough to make a person's mouth feel rough. Some had high acid, high tannin, or both. Those qualities made them unpleasant for fresh eating and valuable for fermentation. Modern grocery apples were bred for appearance, sweetness, storage, and shipping. Traditional cider apples were bred for what happened after they were crushed. "Can you tell what variety it is?" Caleb asked. "Not from one green fruit." Nina looked at the photographs again. "But I know someone who will want to see this." 2 weeks later, Nina returned with Dr. Samuel Price, a retired pomologist who had spent much of his career studying Appalachian fruit. He walked slowly. He carried pruning shears, sample bags, flagging tape, and a notebook held together with a rubber band. By then, the goats had opened nearly 14 acres. Dr. Price stopped at the first terrace and said nothing for several minutes. He studied the stonework, then the spacing, then the angle of the trees. He cut small pieces of leaf and bark, labeled them, and moved uphill. At one tree, he crouched and brushed soil away from the trunk. "At least 90 years, he said. Caleb looked at him. "You can tell that from the bark?" "Not exactly. I can tell from the rootstock, the graft height, and the way it was trained. This style was common here before the Second World War." They spent 6 hours on the property. By late afternoon, they had located 46 living apple trees. Several carried fruit. No 2 fruits looked exactly alike. Some were round, some were long, some were yellow beneath the green skin. One had dark red streaks. Another was shaped almost like a small pear. "This isn't one variety," Dr. Price said. "It's a collection." He asked Caleb about the property's history. All Caleb knew was Ruth Hensley's name. Nina contacted the county clerk's office and began tracing deeds. The Hensley family had owned the property since 1906. Ruth's father, Walter Hensley, had purchased 60 apple trees from a nursery in 1914. A surviving agricultural ledger listed barrels, pressing cloth, 3 fermentation tanks, and a hand-operated cider mill. The family sold fresh apples, vinegar, and hard cider to nearby mining camps and railroad towns. Then Prohibition changed the market. The cider press disappeared from tax records after 1921. Some orchards were cut down. Others were converted to sweeter fruit. The Hensleys kept theirs. A nursery catalog found in a regional archive listed several varieties sold in the county during that period: Virginia Hughes, Kingston Black, Winesap, Harrison, and one local variety called Hensley Bitter. There was no photograph of it, no known surviving tree, only a short description printed in 1924. Small russeted fruit, late ripening, heavy tannin, excellent for blending. Dr. Price returned in October when the apples were ripe. By then, Caleb and the goats had opened 28 acres. They found 63 living trees. 21 were too damaged to produce fruit that year. 42 carried at least a few apples. Dr. Price collected samples from every productive tree. He photographed the fruit, measured it, cut it, recorded seed shape, flesh color, acidity, and tannin. He compared the samples with old nursery descriptions and genetic material from university collections. 7 weeks later, he called Caleb. They had identified 8 distinct cider varieties. 5 matched known heritage apples. 2 were regional types that had not been documented in West Virginia in more than 50 years. The 8th did not match any living sample in the university collection. Its fruit was small and rough-skinned. The flesh was dry, bitter, and almost impossible to eat. Its harvest time, shape, tannin level, and location matched the 1924 description of Hensley Bitter. Dr. Price would not call it confirmed without more testing, but he believed Caleb might be standing on the only surviving trees of a variety that had disappeared from every known orchard. There were 4 of them, all growing on the same upper terrace. All still alive. Barely. One had lost half its crown. Another had a trunk hollow enough for Caleb to put his arm inside. Wild Grape had pulled down 2 major limbs from the third. The 4th carried only 17 apples. "They're in bad condition," Caleb said. Dr. Price nodded. "They've been neglected a long time." "How long do they have?" "If you had found them 5 years later, maybe none." The brush had been hurting the orchard. Vines blocked sunlight. Honeysuckle competed for water. Multiflora rows crowded the trunks. But the overgrowth had also protected the trees in ways nobody intended. Thorny brush kept deer from rubbing the bark. It discouraged people from cutting firewood. It made the hillside too difficult to clear cheaply. The same wall of vegetation that was slowly killing the orchard had also hidden it from everything that might have destroyed it faster. Caleb stood beside the 4 Hensley Bitter trees and thought about the real estate photographs. The agent had taken pictures from the road because there was no way to get inside. Nobody had walked the terraces. Nobody had counted the trees. Nobody had looked at the swollen graft unions, or the stone drainage channels, or the old branches reaching through the vines. The property had been valued by what covered it, not by what survived underneath. Everett came over after he heard. He stood beside the lower stone wall while goats moved through the brush behind him. "So this really was an orchard." "Still is," Caleb said. Everett looked uphill. "My dad talked about the Hensley cider place. I thought it was farther west." "It was here. And these trees have been here the whole time?" "The oldest ones were planted before Ruth was born." Everett removed his cap. "I've driven past this hill almost every day for 46 years. Caleb looked at the trees. So did everybody else. Everett watched June stand on her hind legs and pull leaves from a honeysuckle branch. "And your goats found it." "They didn't find it," Caleb said. "They just made it possible to see." Finding the orchard was the easy part. Saving it took another 2 years. Caleb fenced each tree with a temporary guard so the goats could browse around the orchard without stripping bark from the trunks. He removed vines by hand. He cut dead limbs gradually so the trees would not be shocked by too much pruning at once. He opened the canopy in stages, allowing sunlight to return without exposing every trunk to sudden heat. The goats rotated through small paddocks every few days. They ate the regrowth. Then they moved on. The rows weakened. The honeysuckle thinned. Grass, clover, and native plants began appearing in places where sunlight had not reached the ground in years. The orchard did not become clean. It became visible. The first serious harvest came in the second fall. Not every tree produced. Some never would. But 31 trees carried usable fruit. Caleb filled 74 crates. The apples were too small and rough for a grocery store. Some looked bruised even when they were healthy. Others had russeted skin, uneven shapes, and colors that ranged from dull green to dark red. They looked nothing like supermarket fruit. A small cidery in Lewisburg bought the entire harvest. The owner, Mark Ellison, pressed each variety separately. When he tasted the juice from Hensley Bitter, he stopped talking. The juice was sharp, dry, and deeply tannic. It was terrible on its own. Blended with sweeter apples, it gave the cider structure, aroma, and a finish that stayed after the sweetness disappeared. Mark bought 2,800 pounds of apples that year. The check was $4,620. It was not enough to make Caleb rich. It was enough to prove the orchard had value. By the third year, the trees produced more than twice as much. The cidery released a limited batch called Hensley Ridge. It sold out in 3 weekends. Dr. Price collected scion wood from every identified variety. The university grafted copies onto healthy rootstock at 2 research orchards. Caleb grafted 35 young trees of his own. That meant the 4 fragile Hensley Bitter trees no longer carried the entire future of the variety. Even if a storm split them, even if fire crossed the ridge, even if the hollow trunks finally gave way, their genetics would continue. The land began producing 2 forms of income. The goats gained months of browse from vegetation Caleb once would have paid to remove. The orchard produced fruit with a market that did not exist when he bought the property. His winter feed bill dropped. The land payment stayed at $138 a month, and the property that nobody could walk through became the center of his farm. Everett stopped telling Caleb he had bought a problem. One October afternoon, he came over while Caleb was loading apple crates. The terraces were visible from the road now. Stone walls crossed the hillside in long lines. Goats moved beneath the trees. Red and yellow fruit hung above them. Everett looked toward the upper orchard. I sprayed honeysuckle on my side for 30 years. Most people did. I cleared an old fence row with a dozer in '98. There were apple trees in it. Caleb looked at him. What kind? Everett shook his head. Never checked. They stood quietly for a moment. That's the thing about clearing, Everett said. You find out what was in the way, you don't always find out what was underneath it. Caleb looked across the orchard. No. Everett put his cap back on. Sometimes you have to look before you decide which one is the problem. June is 10 years old now. She still leads the herd. Most afternoons, she browses beneath apple trees planted more than a century before she was born. The multiflora rose is not gone. The honeysuckle is not gone. It probably never will be, but it stays low. The goats keep it within reach. The trees keep their light. And every fall, apples drop onto ground that had once been described as unusable. Laura told Caleb one evening that the whole story still sounded backward. He bought land because it was too overgrown for anyone else. He used goats because he could not afford machines. The goats uncovered trees nobody knew were there. The worst-tasting apples turned out to be the most valuable ones, and a property that could not grow pasture ended up producing meat, cider, grafting wood, and enough browse to reduce the cost of the animals that cleared it. Caleb looked uphill at the terraces. I thought I was buying cheap feed, he said. What did you buy? He considered the question. 100 years of work that nobody could see. The walls had always been there. The orchard had always been there. The old graphs, the drainage channels, the cider apples, and the decisions of the people who planted them had never disappeared. They had only been covered long enough for everyone to assume there was nothing worth finding. Some land is not empty. Some land is not ruined. And some land is not worthless. Sometimes the valuable thing is still there, waiting beneath whatever grew after people stopped paying attention. Caleb did not rescue the orchard by overpowering the hillside. He did it by putting hungry animals in front of plants everybody else wanted to destroy and giving them time to reveal what the thorns had been hiding. Because land does not forget what people built on it. It only waits to see whether anyone will look closely enough to remember.